Your special person took your photo to a psychic, and they cried tears of blood when they heard. Something happened in a quiet room that your special person had entered expecting answers, but within minutes, the person sitting across from them stopped speaking entirely. Their eyes fixed on your photograph. The room became so still that even the ticking clock seemed too loud. Your special person leaned forward, waiting for an explanation. Instead, the psychic slowly placed the photo on the table and whispered, "There's something about this person you were never supposed to discover this way." Your special person's expression changed instantly. They had come because they were confused about you. They wanted to understand why they couldn't let you go, why certain memories kept returning, and why every attempt to move forward somehow brought their thoughts back to you. But they weren't prepared for what the psychic said next. Because according to the story unfolding in that room, your photograph had revealed something deeply emotional, and it forced them to confront a truth they had been avoiding for much longer than they realized. At first, the psychic didn't give them a dramatic prediction. Instead, they asked a strange question. When did you first realize this person mattered to you? Your special person looked down. They didn't answer immediately. Their fingers tightened around the edge of the chair. Then they admitted something they had never said out loud. They remembered the exact moment they started seeing you differently. It wasn't some grand romantic scene. It was something small. A look. A conversation. A moment when you showed understanding without asking for anything in return. The psychic listened carefully, then looked back at your picture. "That's why this connection feels unfinished," they said. "You're not carrying a memory. You're carrying a question." Your special person swallowed hard. Suddenly, the visit wasn't about predicting the future anymore. It was about understanding the past. And there was one particular detail in your photograph that made the psychic pause longer than before. They turned the picture slightly toward the light, studying your expression as though searching for something hidden between the lines of your face. Then came the sentence that made your special person's entire posture change. "They've been wondering whether you still remember them the way they remember you." Your special person's eyes filled instantly. They tried to laugh it off, but the emotion was already there. The psychic noticed. "You're afraid you waited too long," they said. Silence. No answer. Just a slow breath and a tear rolling down your special person's cheek. And then, according to the story, the psychic revealed the part they had not expected at all. Something about a decision, a missed opportunity, and a moment that could still change everything. Your special person suddenly reached for your photograph again. This time, they weren't looking at it with curiosity. They were looking at it like someone who had finally realized what they had almost lost. And what happened immediately afterward is the reason they may be much closer to contacting you than you think. The words had barely left the psychic's mouth when your special person asked the question they had been holding back all along. "Are they still waiting for me?" The psychic didn't answer immediately. Instead, they looked at the photograph again, then at the person sitting across from them. "Waiting isn't the right word," they said. "They're trying to move forward without knowing whether you ever understood what they felt." That answer hit differently. Your special person lowered their eyes, because suddenly they remembered every message they almost sent, every conversation they ended too quickly, every moment when pride made them pretend they didn't care. The psychic explained that sometimes the strongest connections aren't obvious because both people become experts at hiding what matters most. Then came another unexpected detail. "There's something you never told them," the psychic said. "And they've been interpreting your silence as an answer." Your special person froze. Because they knew exactly what secret the psychic was talking about. It was the truth behind their distance. They hadn't pulled away because their feelings disappeared. They had pulled away because their feelings became too difficult to manage. They were afraid of choosing wrong. Afraid of being rejected. Afraid that if they finally admitted how deeply they cared, they would lose the emotional protection they had built around themselves. The psychic leaned closer and said, "You've been protecting yourself from a possibility that may have already passed." That sentence broke through the last bit of resistance. Your special person wiped their face, but another tear followed. They looked at your photograph and quietly said your name. Then something almost ordinary happened that felt extraordinary in that moment. They turned the picture over and stared at the blank back of it. "I should have told them," they whispered. The psychic nodded. "Then why haven't you?" For several seconds, there was no response. Finally, your special person admitted, "Because I don't know if I still have the right to." If this story is touching something you felt but couldn't explain, you can share it with someone who might understand. And if you enjoy stories about unexpected emotional turns, you're welcome to stay connected for the next one. But there was still one piece of information the psychic hadn't revealed. They reached for a notebook beside them and wrote down a date. Your special person stared at it, confused. "Why that date?" they asked. The psychic answered calmly, "Because something connected to this relationship may come back into your life around then. No promise. No guarantee. Just a possibility." Yet your special person looked shaken. They immediately remembered something that had happened around that same time in the past, something they had dismissed as coincidence. Now the memory felt different. They stood up slowly, picked up your photograph, and held it against their chest for a moment before placing it back on the table. Then they asked one final question: "If I reach out, will they know why?" The psychic looked at them and smiled gently. "Not unless you finally tell them." And that was the moment your special person made a decision they had been avoiding for far too long. The decision came quietly, almost without drama. Your special person pulled out their phone, unlocked the screen, and opened your conversation. The last message between you was still there. They read it once. Then again. Their thumb hovered over the keyboard, but they couldn't type. The psychic watched without interrupting. Finally, your special person whispered, "What if they don't want to hear from me anymore?" The psychic answered with a question of their own: "What if you never give them the chance to tell you?" That sentence landed harder than anything else that had been said that day. Your special person looked back at your photograph, and suddenly the room seemed smaller. All the excuses they had used to justify their silence were still there, but they no longer sounded convincing. They began remembering moments you had shown patience when they didn't deserve it, moments when you noticed their mood without being told, and moments when you gave them space without truly leaving. Then the psychic pointed toward the photograph. "You keep wondering whether they still care," they said. But the more important question is whether you're finally ready to show them that you do. Your special person closed their eyes. For the first time, they stopped trying to predict what might happen. They simply allowed themselves to feel everything they had been avoiding. Regret, affection, hope. And underneath all of it, a strange sense of relief. Because the truth was becoming impossible to hide from themselves. They didn't need a psychic to tell them what their heart already knew. They missed you. Not just your presence, but the version of themselves they remembered being around you. The psychic then said something that changed the entire atmosphere. Your photograph doesn't show me someone waiting for rescue. It shows me someone who has learned their worth. Your special person looked up sharply. That wasn't what they expected. Then what am I supposed to do? They asked. The answer was simple. Stop approaching them from fear. If you return, return honestly. Those words stayed with them. They slowly typed a message, deleted it, typed another, and deleted that one too. Every version sounded too casual. Too rehearsed. Too safe. Until finally, they began writing what they actually wanted to say. The first line was only a few words, but it carried months of emotion behind it. They stared at the screen for nearly a minute before continuing. They wanted to tell you they hadn't forgotten. They wanted to explain why they disappeared when they should have stayed present. They wanted to admit that your absence had taught them something your presence never could. How much they had taken your emotional honesty for granted. But there was still one confession they couldn't bring themselves to type. The psychic noticed the hesitation and said, "That's the sentence you're avoiding." Your special person looked up. What sentence? The psychic smiled. The one that would make you vulnerable. Your special person slowly placed the phone on the table. Then they looked at your photograph one more time. Their expression softened. I think I know what I have to say. They picked up the phone again. This time, they didn't hesitate. And what they wrote next wasn't an apology, a prediction, or a casual hello. It was the truth they had been carrying all along, and once you hear what that truth was, the entire reason they took your photograph to that psychic begins to make sense. The message began with something painfully simple: I should have told you this a long time ago. Your special person stopped after typing those words, staring at them as though they had finally crossed a line they could never uncross. Then they continued. They admitted that they had spent far too much time pretending they were unaffected, when the truth was completely different. Certain songs reminded them of you. Certain places made them wonder whether you had ever stood there thinking about them too. Even ordinary moments could suddenly bring back a memory they thought they had buried. But the most difficult confession came next. They admitted they had been afraid that reaching out would expose how deeply they still cared. The psychic watched silently as the message grew longer. Then your special person typed a sentence that made their own eyes fill again. I never stopped wondering what would have happened if I had been brave enough to choose honesty. They read it 3 times. Their finger hovered over send. And then they did something unexpected. They didn't send it yet. Instead, they turned toward the psychic and asked, "What if I'm too late?" The psychic didn't promise an outcome. They simply said, "Then let the truth exist anyway." That answer seemed to settle something inside them. Because suddenly the purpose of the message wasn't to guarantee a reunion. It wasn't to force an answer. It was to stop hiding. Your special person had spent so long trying to control the outcome that they had forgotten something important. Sometimes closure comes from finally saying what should have been said, whether the other person responds immediately or not. They looked at your photograph again, and the emotional weight in their expression became almost impossible to miss. The psychic quietly said, "You brought me their picture because you wanted me to tell you what they feel. But maybe you already knew." Your special person smiled through their tears. "I think I did." Then they finally pressed send. For a few seconds, nothing happened. The screen remained still. No reply. No notification. Just silence. Yet strangely, they looked calmer than they had when they walked into that room. And then came the part neither of them expected. A notification appeared, not from you, but from an old conversation they hadn't opened in months. It was a memory attached to a message from the past, something you had once said that suddenly carried an entirely different meaning. Your special person read it slowly. Then they looked at the psychic and whispered, "I forgot about this." The psychic didn't need to ask what it was. Your special person explained that the message had been sent during a time when both of you were emotionally confused, but there had been one sentence hidden inside it that they had misunderstood completely. They had believed you were letting go. Now, reading it again, they realized you may have been protecting yourself. That discovery changed the emotional direction of the entire visit. Your special person wasn't crying because something terrible had been predicted. They were overwhelmed because a possibility they had buried suddenly felt alive again. They picked up your photograph, held it gently, and said, "Maybe this isn't the end of our story." But there was still one question neither of them could answer, and the answer was about to arrive from the one person they had been waiting to hear from all along. The phone vibrated before your special person could even put it down. For one frozen second, they simply stared at the screen. Your name had appeared. Their breath caught. They looked at the psychic, almost as if they needed permission to believe what they were seeing. But there was no need. The message was real. You had responded. Your special person opened it with trembling fingers, expecting something cautious, perhaps a short reply that would leave everything uncertain. Instead, the first sentence made their expression completely change. You had written, "I was wondering when you were finally going to say it." They read it twice. Then they covered their mouth, overwhelmed by the realization that you may have understood far more than they ever imagined. The psychic quietly stepped back, giving them privacy. Your special person kept reading. You weren't angry. You weren't demanding explanations. You simply acknowledged that there had been things left unsaid on both sides. And then you asked one question: "Are you finally ready to be honest with me?" That question erased every carefully constructed defense they had brought into the room. They looked down at your photograph, and the tears came again, not from fear, but from the strange relief of realizing that the door they thought had been permanently closed might never have been completely shut. They typed a response, stopped, erased it, and finally decided there was no reason to hide anymore. They told you about the visit. They told you they had brought your photograph to someone because they couldn't understand why the connection still affected them so deeply. They even admitted that hearing certain things about you had made them emotional. But they didn't tell you everything. There was one part they still couldn't explain without sounding almost unbelievable. The psychic had noticed a detail about your connection that your special person had never mentioned. Something about the timing. Something about a repeated pattern. Something that had happened separately in both of your lives without either person knowing about it. When your special person finally revealed that detail, your response was immediate. Wait. That happened to me too. For several moments, neither of you knew what to say. Your special person showed the psychic your message. The psychic read it carefully, then smiled in a way that suggested the most important part of the visit had never been the prediction. It had been the conversation that followed. You came here looking for certainty, the psychic said. But what you really needed was courage. Your special person looked at your photograph again. This time, they weren't searching for signs about the future. They were looking at the person they had almost lost through hesitation, fear, and silence. And suddenly they understood why the tears had come so strongly. Not because some terrible fate had been revealed, but because they had finally realized how much emotional truth had been sitting between two people who were both waiting for the other to speak first. Then your next message appeared on the screen. It contained only a few words, but those words changed the direction of everything. I think we need to talk. Your special person stood up immediately. The psychic watched them gather their things. But before they walked out, the psychic said one final sentence, and your special person stopped at the door. The psychic's final words followed them into the hallway. When you meet them, don't give them the version of yourself you've been rehearsing. Give them the truth. Your special person stood there for a moment, hand resting against the door, letting those words settle. Then they walked outside. The afternoon air felt completely different from the room they had just left. They looked down at their phone. Your conversation was still open. This time, there was no carefully constructed speech, no attempt to sound unaffected. They simply wrote, "Tell me where you are." Minutes later, your reply came. You gave them a place and a time. Nothing dramatic. Nothing cinematic on the surface. Just two people agreeing to finally sit across from each other after carrying too many unfinished thoughts for too long. But as your special person made their way there, something unexpected happened. They passed a place connected to one of your earliest memories together. They slowed down, smiled to themselves, and realized that maybe the real purpose of the psychic visit had never been to predict what would happen. Maybe it had simply pushed them to stop running from what had already happened. When they finally saw you, everything they had imagined disappeared. You weren't standing there with anger in your eyes. You weren't demanding an explanation. You simply looked at them quietly, almost as if you were waiting to see whether they would finally choose honesty. Your special person walked closer. For several seconds, neither of you spoke. Then they said, "I brought your picture somewhere today." You raised an eyebrow, surprised. They smiled nervously and explained everything. The questions. The photograph. The unexpected emotional reaction. The conversation about the past. And eventually, the message they had sent you. You listened without interrupting. But when they reached the part about the psychic noticing that you had both experienced a strangely similar moment, your expression changed. You knew exactly what they meant. You told them your side of the story, and suddenly two separate memories became one shared story. Details that had seemed meaningless at the time suddenly connected. A missed opportunity here. A misunderstood message there. A moment when one of you thought the other had moved on. A moment when the other was actually waiting for reassurance. Neither of you had stopped caring. You had simply been speaking through silence. Then came the conversation that changed the emotional weight of the entire meeting. Your special person looked directly at you and said, "I don't want to keep guessing anymore." You remained quiet. They continued. "I don't want another person to tell me what you feel. I want to hear it from you." That sentence mattered because it transformed everything. The photograph had brought them to the psychic, but your actual conversation was bringing them somewhere much more meaningful: honesty. You finally told them what you had been afraid to admit. They listened. No interruptions.